It is really my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Matt Stull, who's the residency director for University Hospital's Emergency Medicine program. And he's also associate professor of emergency medicine, anesthesiology, and medical education at Case Western Reserve University. Matt is an actively practicing emergency critical care physician who works both in the emergency department as well as at the cardiothoracic ICU at UH. He's passionate about supporting learners as they transition from undergraduate to graduate medical education and has served as the School of Medicine's director for the transition to residency program, which was really critical. And we're so appreciative to Matt for helping us get the transition to residency program started. In addition, Matt is the founding fellowship director for the medical education and academic leadership program in the Department of Emergency Medicine. He completed his emergency medicine residency at the University of Cincinnati, his critical care fellowship at the University of Michigan, go blue, and his medical education fellowship in Washington, D.C. And what is not listed in Matt's bio is that a handful of years ago, he completed the Interprofessional Scholars Collaboration in Teaching and Learning. And that, I think, is where I met Matt for the first time. So Matt, we're really delighted to welcome you here for our medical education grand rounds and look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you so much. It's rare, at least at my stature, to get your bio read in front of you. So that's always, awkward as you just cringe. I thank you all for joining me today. I am incredibly passionate about this idea of connecting the theory of education with what we do as clinical educators. And I will say the focus of this talk is really about the bedside clinical experience and being a bedside educator. But what I hope to do for you all today is really connect some of the great thinkers in adult learning science and theory with what we do on a daily basis, and really try to help you build a scaffold of that sort of understanding of the science into the practice. I'm a big believer in the scholarship of integration and teaching. And so hopefully today we'll be able to, cite or at least name some of these big thinkers like Vygotsky, Malcolm Knowles, and David Kolb about how they inform our daily practice in the clinical environment. And as Dr. Wilson-Delfos highlighted, I am a stressaholic, right? Like, I love stress. I work in an emergency department. I work in a cardiothoracic ICU. If a good code isn't happening somewhere in the world, I don't feel fulfilled. So one of the things I'm going to sort of fill my perspective in on is at sort of the critical care aspect of how to incorporate these lessons we're going to learn over the course of the next little while. I also encourage you, please feel free to come off mute and ask questions in real time as I sort of bring up some topics. I welcome the questions to interrupt the presentation as opposed to just waiting till the very end. I know that's a little harder to do on Zoom. I'm a motor mouth from New Jersey, so I do move quickly, but do not hesitate to stop me or go back and we can kind of continue the conversation. But my goal is, by the end of this session, is for us to really look at the difference between pedagogy and andragogy, right? These are two very different concepts, and I want to make sure that we're focused in on the important one for the learners we're serving. We're going to talk a little bit about this idea of a zone of proximal development and how to really make that the centerpiece of your bedside teaching. We're going to spend a little bit of time about this idea of learner preferences and how you can use those to really leverage your teaching in the clinical environment. And then last but not least, I really hope that by the end of this session, this is a session about practicality. This is about taking theory and making it into practice. And so my hope is that we can really affect your practice as educators by the end of this. And, I just saw my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Dell, log on. And so it makes me think about PEDS. And what is the classic PEDS adage? But kids are not just little adults. And that is true both physiologically as well as from a learning psychology standpoint. That adult learning is not the same thing as childhood learning. When we are kids, our brain is wired to be a passive sponge. You know how we know that? Because we refuse to curse in front of them. Why? Because they will just repeat that same expletive over and over and over again. I'm clearly a very bad uncle, right? I am just that person that teaches the kids all the curse words accidentally. Why do they do that? Have you ever wondered that? Because ultimately, kids are passive sponges. They will pick up anything out of context and use it. Adults don't work like that, right? When you think about the sort of things you learned as a kid just because the truth of the matter is no one ever made an argument for why you should learn what the color blue is or what a square is, but we learned it. For some godforsaken reason, we learned it and used it in our day-to-day life. Adults don't learn like that. So we need to take a step back and think about how adult learners are not just big kids. How are they different? And this comes, the idea of andragogy or adult learning science, that's all andragogy really is really new. When you get right down to it, the story of, child psych has been around for centuries, quite frankly. But adult learning science and adult developmental science is something that's really new. Malcolm Knowles really just started talking about it in the 80s. And so this idea of andragogy really focuses on 5 core principles that differentiate us as adult learners versus the children that we often have learned or thought about teaching. The first is that adults are independent and self-directed. Adults are going to learn what adults want to learn and the way they want to learn it. We can't always dictate that. And so we need to respect that autonomy that adults create that really is intrinsic to the way they're going to learn. The other piece, as to be an effective adult educator, you have to recognize that adults have experience, a lived experience that is a rich sort of, cultivating field on which to build your education or teaching to them. Beyond that, adults value relevance and are not going to learn things that are not relevant to their day-to-day life. And, I like to liken this to say, like, how many of you as kids were like obsessed with dinosaurs? I know I was. And anytime I ask that, there's like a smattering of hands usually go up, because ultimately, why did we care? Like, why did we care what a pterodactyl was versus a tyrannosaurus? They were not relevant to our day-to-day life. Yeah, maybe they seemed cool at the time, but clearly none of us grew up to be anthropologists or archaeologists. So ultimately, kids learn because they're passive sponges. Adults need relevance. If I told you that the rest of this lecture was going to be about pterodactyls, every one of you would log off if you haven't already. And so I totally understand that, because it needs to be relevant to our day-to-day. And along that lines, it has to be problem-centered. Adults learn to solve problems. They don't learn content just for the sake of content. Our brains rewire after, our mid-20s to really push out the useless content and focus on the stuff that actually gets us, points in day-to-day life. No one's caring about points on the test anymore. You don't see a lot of, elderly folks playing trivia. That is a game for the young man's game, if you will. So we need to actually have information and learn information that will solve a problem for us on a day-to-day. And ultimately, we should, in theory, be internally motivated. And most of us are. We are far more about learning for self-discovery, self-enrichment, or in the case of our trainees, for the good of patients, right? That internal motivation goes a much longer way than, I promise you a cookie if you learn this. Right now, if any of you have actually read a recent randomized control trial in the Journal of Medical Education, they actually did this, which makes me say that medical education, because the students did learn for the cookies and not necessarily for just, internal motivation. I want to highlight that means that we in medical education have trained our trainees to be far more pedagogical in the way they learn than andragogical. Certainly, the early part of medical school really does not fulfill many of the premises of andragogy. Now, don't get me wrong, undergraduate med ed is moving in that direction, right? If you think about it as, maybe you sort of had a more traditional style, 2 years in the classroom, 2 years in the clinical environment, and maybe you had problem-centered learning, right? Once upon a time, it was just lectures. Now we're going into TBL, PBL, things like that. But the truth of the matter is, when you think about these principles, how well does an undergraduate medical education scratch this itch? And I'll tell you, as the person who directs like transitioning to residency and helps support our learners, I've done this at 3 different institutions now. None of us are doing this exceedingly well at the undergraduate level. But then they get to graduate medical education, and it is an abrupt change. Man, andragogy is all over the GME space. If you've ever experienced, for those of you that have gone through residency, it is exceedingly independent. You either learn it on your own. There's no force feeding of content necessarily to you. It is very much based on the experience of the patients you see, highly relevant day to day. You're seeing and changing the plans of these patients, obviously problem-centered. And again, hopefully you're learning for the good of taking care of those patients and not necessarily just, for the cookie or the grade at the end of it. Now, I want to flip this script a little bit and think about this as an educator, because where have we learned to educate? Have we learned to educate in a more sort of pedagogical view where we're looking at, we've learned from our grade school teachers or things like that, or even our med school teachers? Or have we learned from the andragogical perspective that GME is really based in, which is stepping back and giving the learner space, not necessarily insisting that it be learned this way at this time during this process? I would argue that we as educators have for a long time modeled ourselves after pedagogical teaching rather than andragogical. And I think to get the most out of our clinical trainees, especially at the bedside, we need to start shifting and understanding these processes that govern adult learning far more than necessarily sort of the expecting our learners to be passive sponges. Because ultimately, clinical learning is about behavior change, right? It is not about the content often. Let's be honest, most students are as smart as they're going to be right at the end of second year, right? Right as they finish that second year and take step 1, they have all the knowledge they need to really, apply. Now it's a question of application. It's a question of skill building. It's a question of actually putting that knowledge into action or behavior that really matters. So we as bedside educators really need to be thinking about, is it that they really need to learn that much more about AFib or any of these other disease processes we may be seeing in the clinical environment? Or is it about changing their behavior to be an effective clinician in that bedside space? And I would posit that the best applied andragogy comes long before Knowles sort of talked to us about what that word meant and what we should assume about adult education. But this comes from a learning theorist from the turn of the century named Lev Vygotsky. He was Russian, and he really posited this idea that adults want to live in a comfort zone. Right? The comfort zone, if you will, is, us watching TV on the couch with popcorn under a Snuggie, right? That feels good. But let's be honest, none of us have ever actually grown from that experience. Sure, you can watch as meaningful, deep Ken Burns documentary as you want, but the truth of the matter is we haven't actually learned it, imbibed it, and used it in any meaningful way when you're in your comfort zone. It's only when we get outside of our comfort zone that we learn. The problem is, as we are learning, the world outside our comfort zone is a danger zone, right? This is a place where ultimately we can't learn, we can't function, we can't grow because we're too overwhelmed. You know, the Maslow's hierarchy, going back to sometimes just our physiologic needs aren't met. And if we're hungry or sleep deprived, we can't function. But forget that, you know, you go up higher on Maslow's hierarchy. And if we just are not fulfilled, if we actually are not in a mental space ready to learn, we're not going to learn. And so the danger zone, you know, is all right outside that comfort zone. But ultimately, there is a place right outside our comfort zone, but yet not yet tipping into the danger zone that we have to be aware of as clinical educators. And that's called the zone of proximal development, or the ZPD. You'll hear me refer to it for the rest of this talk. The ZPD is this idea that this is the space in which we grow. Because the comfort zone is things that we already can do. If we're in our comfort zone, that's something we're already skilled at doing, right? I look at this as when I get early third year students in our clerkship, for example, those are people who are very comfortable taking a straightforward history and physical. But the moment you throw the patient who is, you know, tangential at them, or, you know, has a pan positive review of systems, that takes them outside that comfort zone maybe, but they can take that straightforward history and physical because they've done that time and time again in the preclinical setting. Now, the danger zone, this is things that they absolutely could not do. This is me looking at my interns on the first day of residency and saying, hey, you know what, that patient's in tamponade. Why don't you just go stick a needle in his heart and drain it? Sphincter tone would be exceedingly high. And as a result, they can't learn from that experience. Don't get me wrong. I have a couple interns that would run at that. That doesn't mean they'd actually learn anything meaningful by like doing it. And so the reality is we as educators need to be focused constantly about where our learners in the clinical environment are, and are they in their ZPD, or zone of proximal development, because this is ultimately where their growth is going to occur. And this is you have to understand, this graph, this, you know, chart is context dependent, right? Depending on where we are in our career and where we are in our training, this can sort of expand or contract to allow, you know, to be whatever we may be feeling at the time. And so, you know, I want to highlight what I think happens over the course of clinical training. Think back to your first day as a clerk, whatever clerkship you may have experienced. For me, it was surgery. That was overwhelming. And I remember what my ZPD looked like. It looked something like this, right? A little tiny core of like comfort zone. I know how to take a history. My ZPD was maybe I can wash my hands effectively in the OR. I'm not really sure that I can. And then there was a whole lot of danger zone. You know, what actually does it look like? How do I gown and glove effectively? You know, what are rounds only take 30 seconds? What's going, like, where are the bathrooms, right? Like that alone puts you in a huge area of danger zone. And this is true of pretty much every step of early clinical training. Every time they switch clerkships, what are my expectations? How am I going to pass, let alone honor, etc.? Or even when they get to residency, where's the bathrooms? How long am I going to be here? What am I going to kill someone today by just tapping my badge and actually following through on an order? So think about that the next time you're working with those early learners, as we're coming up to a new academic year here very shortly. But then you, as a practicing clinician in your chosen specialty, this is what you have to be. Right? You've got to have this huge comfort zone of different ways that patients can present, or approaches to problems, whatever it may be. Now, I am admittedly a generalist, right? I'm an emergency physician. I see everything from foreign bodies in the eye to trimalleolar fractures to acute coronary syndrome. And so our comfort zone has to be very, very broad. It's not always deep, but it's certainly broad. But that's true of all of us in the patients that we see, because let's be honest, we play for keeps, right? We're caring for patients, and their lives can sometimes be on the line. And while our comfort zone has to be huge, our zone of proximal development can't go away even when we're attending physicians, because let's be honest, there's no guarantee that you will have seen that presentation or done that procedure before you're finished your clinical training. And so you still have to be willing to push that boundary. Presumably, you've learned how to do it, or you've practiced it in sim or anything like that. But you ultimately have to be willing to step right outside that comfort zone. And then the danger zone has to be pretty darn small when you're talking about patients' mortality and morbidity and everything in between. And so our clinical trainees have to transition from this place of exceptional danger to a place where, honestly, their comfort zones are extensive. And ultimately, it's our job as the bedside educator to push the boundaries of that comfort and zone of proximal development to the very extent that we can. And that's how I think about us as clinicians when I think about, our job as clinician educators. I think of us as catalysts. This is a catalytic converter, if you will. Quite frankly, many of us probably don't know what the heck that is and feel far more comfortable with this organic chemistry graph, right? Which is, what does a catalyst do? But lowers the entry energy it takes for change to happen. And that is ultimately what we as educators are all about. Catalysts that constantly are drawing our trainee into their zone of proximal development, while also not letting them fall into their danger zone. And when they do, helping them draw them back towards that ZPD. So how do we catalyze that change in our learners? And I want to introduce you to one more theory and one more sort of, thinker in this space, which is David Kolb. And I am a huge fanboy of David Kolb, in part because he actually is a professor emeritus at Case. I met him a couple months ago. He found me very awkward because I asked for an autograph. But ultimately, I am a huge fan of this guy and the way he thinks about the sort of psychological roots of learning. Because what he looks at is that experiential piece that we as adults do to learn. And when you think about it, for us to learn, we follow the exact same process. And it's a cycle. And it, honestly, it even reminds me a lot of reflex arcs and things like that when you get right down to it. So the first step in any learning encounter is a concrete experience. There's a feeling that we all have. There's some sort of sensation, if you will. Now, we're dealing with a ton of sensations. My hope is that you're attending to what I'm saying and what's coming up on your screen right now. But the truth of the matter is, your brain is processing a lot, right? You're feeling how warm or cool it is in the room that you're in. You may not notice it right now until I draw attention to it. What does the floor feel like under your feet? Those sort of things are things that we process out all the time, but ultimately we are feeling. The next step of it is, do we actually reflectively observe it? Do we actually attend or watch what's going on in our environment? In many cases, again, all of those things I just listed that you're actually feeling, you're not attending to, and therefore not learning about. Ultimately, it's only when we attend and watch that sort of next phase that we can learn something from it. Then, because we're adults and we have a rich internal conception of the world, there's an internal scaffold on which we organize our thinking, that we actually process what we're hearing, what we're doing, what we're knowing, what we're growing from. And so we have to layer in our own lived experience into the new information that may be coming at us. And last but not least, we act on it, right? We actively put that into practice in some way, shape, or form. And by doing so, affect the lived experience, and we can feel it again. And so when you think about it, every single learning experience you've had has kind of gone, as an adult at least, has gone through this. You have to have a feeling. You have to observe it, attend, watch it. You have to layer it on and think about it in the worldview that you already have, and then you act on it in some way, shape, or form. Again, I liken this even to a reflex arc in a lot of ways, quite frankly, because all of these are fatigable, but also can be refined as you learn. Now, Kolb thought that while each of us goes through this process on everything that we actually learn, we all have a preference towards the way maybe we prefer actively doing things. Maybe we're more of watchers. Maybe we feel things more. But ultimately, he found that there are two continuums between these things. There's the perception continuum, and this is how we perceive the world around us. Are we more concrete, experienced people who really live in our feelings, if you will? Or do we have a really rich conception of the world inside our head and are more thinkers when it comes sort of perceiving the world more logically in a sort of pattern in that sense? The other continuum he talks about is this processing continuum. This is sort of thinking about how we do things once we start to learn them. Are we people that step back and reflect and observe? Or are we more hands-on, jumping in and doing, putting into effect the world, or affecting the world by processing it in some way, shape, or form? And so when you get right down to it, Kolb has created this cycle that everyone goes through every time they learn, but there is this sort of quadrant system. And this quadrant system allows us to think about our learners or ourselves. I would encourage you to think about this as I talk through each of these quadrants and where you fall as a learner and your learning preference, okay? Every one of us has an innate preference towards one or two of these areas on each of these continuums. So the first one we're going to talk a little bit about is that of the diverger, okay? The diverger is a person who is in their feelings a good bit. They appreciate, they process the world through watching, but perceive it through concrete experience, okay? So these are the feelers and the watchers. Divergers classically are people who, really appreciate learning by listening, but also appreciate sharing their own ideas. They excel when viewing direct experiences from many perspectives, but they also appreciate the harmony that comes from stepping back and watching and taking perspective. These in the house of medicine are classically, now let me be clear, I'm boiling this down to help as a teaching point. There is no right style of learning, but I classically define these people as psychiatrists, right? They like to step back and think and take perspective broadly in the way that they learn and grow. Next up are the assimilators. Assimilators tend to be people who perceive information abstractly and process it reflectively, right? They're people that appreciate the deep insight or theoretical approach to the world. They can certainly appreciate detail orientation. They're people that tend to really be critical of the data that they get and love good data. They're thoughtful about it and tackle problems very rationally. These tend to be people who the school was made for. They appreciate book learning, theory behind maybe any practice thoughtfully. Now, one of the things you have to understand about the way I sort of boil that assimilators down in the house of medicine are some of the more hospital-based specialties, the people that really appreciate being right or wrong, pathology, radiology. There is cancer in those cells or there are not. There is a broken bone or there is not. Again, don't get me wrong. If you're not a pathologist that's an assimilator, that doesn't make you not a good pathologist. It's just a tendency towards that sort of personality trait or type of person. The next category is that of the converger. The converger tends to be while they still really appreciate a theoretical viewpoint of the world, they tend to act on the world. They appreciate the one way to do things. They tend to be very thoughtful logisticians who are not always focused on the perspective or the fuzzy feelings in the world, but really are very skills oriented. This is classically the surgical subspecialties, right? They appreciate the world, they think about the world through an anatomic perspective, perhaps, but then ultimately boil it down to, can I operate on it or not? And again, I'm being overly simplistic and overly generalizing more to get my points across than actually saying, summarizing any specific specialty. Last but not least is the accommodators. The accommodators are people who, quite frankly, perceive information concretely, but then process it actively. They tend to be learners who trial by error a lot. They have a strong intuition that gets them to the right answer, but maybe for all the wrong reasons, or at least don't understand the reasons that get there, right? They're on the exact opposite end from those assimilators down in that bottom quadrant that we talked about a moment ago. The accommodator is that person who honestly sort of dives right in and doesn't always understand why they may be right, but did it anyway. The classic person I talk about, in part because I'm guilty of it myself, is emergency medicine, right? I don't see any other EM folks on the call, but all of you upstairs always look down on us. Don't get me wrong. I don't mean look your nose down on us, but look down on us and like, yeah, you got the patient there, but do you have any idea why? And usually we're like, no, but we just moved along and kept going, right? We dispositioned correctly. So ultimately, those are the sort of personality traits slash, subspecialties I always like to sort of limit this to. But why do we do this experience? We do this and highlight this because we have to recognize that, number one, we as learners have a preference towards one of these styles. We all live in one of these categories. And I want to be clear, I've been a little oversimplifying exactly what each of these means and does. And there is no such thing as an ideal learner in any of our specialties or clinical disciplines. But ultimately, if we don't first recognize that all of us have an intrinsic preference, and some of us lie, sort of central in our category, or some of us are deep, deep, deep down here. And the deeper we are, the more that preference means something to us, and the way we're going to practice plays a big role. And ultimately, we need to be thoughtful about this, because the other thing is these are flexible, right? These change over the course of our experience potentially, and context matters, right? So I'd love for you guys to take a second and think about, where are you in this sort of these domains? I'll give you a second. Now, where were you at the end of studying for step one? Did you move a little bit? I can almost guarantee you we all moved down into this category, right? When we're forced to study for hours and hours and hours on end, just to understand that G protein structure and this, that, and the other thing, then we're going to move down. It doesn't mean that you necessarily cross categories and become an assimilator, but even the deepest accommodator or diverger of us all get pulled back down there. What does third and fourth year of medical school force us to do? It forces us to move from, the end when there's a single right multiple choice answer over to that converger category, where there needs to be a single right answer in the OR or on medicine rounds or whatever it may be. But ultimately, we still have to act a little bit more. And so recognize we can be flexible, and context matters in this situation. But ultimately, there is no one right learning style. But in order to be an effective educator, an effective teacher, we need to generally recognize, we need to recognize that we should sit at the center of this and be able to easily look into each and every one of these categories and think about the learner that is in them, and how we can engage those learners that are sitting in these areas goes a really long way to how effective we can be in the clinical environment, right? So the first thing we need to be able to do, putting all of this theory together, is identify where our learner is on this sort of zone of proximal development, right? So if your learner is sitting there in their danger zone, you start having a conversation with them and they are just frozen. They're not even ready to answer you about whatever may be going on with your patient. Then your job as a clinical educator is to pull them back towards their ZPD. How do we do that, knowing that we all have different styles and preferences for the way we learn? We figure that out and we bring them back we start asking questions or teaching them in the strategy that works best for the quadrant that they live in, right? So if they just came to the wards for the first time as a third-year medical student, maybe it's that they just came off doing a whole lot of assimilator stuff. They are used to and comfortable taking a multiple choice test. They are ready to kill those boards, right? Well, then maybe if we're sitting there asking really thoughtful questions about a patient's perspective and maybe why it is that they're a smoker despite having really bad PAD and acute coronary syndrome and such, and they're not ready to understand that, maybe we need to step back and pull them back towards the quadrant that they naturally reside in, because honestly, they're in their danger zone and are not in a space in which that they can actually learn this material meaningfully. So one of the things I always like to do is really get a sense of what kind of learner they are when I first start working with them. They don't always know this, right? They aren't primed to necessarily know this information about themselves, but they generally do understand, are they a hands-on learner, or do they like the book style learning? And then as I start asking questions and realizing where they are in that zone of proximal development, if they fall into that danger zone, I really try to go back to the things that make them comfortable. If they're a diverger, it's understanding the patient's perspective. It's really stepping back and understanding where the patient is coming from, their lived experience, that sort of thing. If it's the assimilator, it's a question about the theory behind what it is that is going on with the patient. The converger tends to like to put that into practice, tends to be a little bit more sort of focused on the practical, the what do I do about this, the management style. And the accommodator just wants to do it. They just want to dive in. And so if they're really uncomfortable, let them go. Give them a little bit of leash. Maybe it's a monitor leash, right? Maybe it's being there in the room as they take that history and physical to be able to provide them with meaningful feedback, but they just want to dive in. So getting a sense of what your learner how your learner learns, and when you realize they're overwhelmed, pull them back to the ZPD by doing the thing that they naturally prefer to do in their learning style. Now, what about that learner that's maybe a more senior resident that you're working with, that's clearly in their comfort zone? They've handled many cases like this before, and I love when a learner says to me, in my practice pattern, that just tweaks me off in a way that really just drives me crazy. I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but it's like, you're still here to learn, right? You shouldn't have quite a practice pattern until you go out and actually become an attending. I find far too many of my trainees have practice patterns far too early. But ultimately, if they're in their comfort zone, right? I think about this a lot with something like atrial fibrillation. There are like 5 good solutions to AFib with RVR. And if you're in my practice, I always use beta blockers, that's really a struggle, right? Because what happens when the patient comes in and says, I have really bad asthma, I can never take one of those, or, has a contraindication or an allergy or something like that? Are you really going to be that attending that goes out in the world and only ever uses one strategy? I say the same thing about the way we manage airways. I try to, early on, my residents that are first doing airways are in their danger zone. And so we just find them a comfortable way to do it. But my third years that are about to go out on their own, I make them handicapped. I give them one hand, I blind an eye, and then make them use a blade they've never used before. I'm kidding. But ultimately, I want that learner who's in their comfort zone to still be pushed towards their ZPD. It's my job to catalyze their change. And the way I do this is by putting them in the absolute opposite diagonal quadrant from where they live. Now, this is really easy for those of us that get to work with residents, and especially for long term, right? Those of us that are residency directors or in residency education get to know these people over time and get to figure out really what quadrant they may live in. And so that accommodator that often gets it right, because they just feel like it was the right thing, I look at and say, like, what made you say that? Right? What is it about this case that made you say that? Because they tend not to spend a lot of time in this domain of reflective observation or really thinking about the concepts that underlie the process. And so that person that's already in their comfort zone, that's getting it right, that's doing it well, pull them in the exact opposite, exact opposite sort of strategy to get them to think about it, right? The converger that wants one correct answer and just do needs to be challenged on their perspective. The assimilator needs to be pushed to act once in a while, those sort of things. And so last but not least is this learner that you sense is in their ZPD. They did it well. They aren't overwhelmed by what it is that they were tasked with in the clinical environment. They're clearly not in their danger zone, but they also maybe aren't in their comfort zone. They really do seem like they're stretching their skills. In order to continue to be the catalyst for change and to help those people learn, you really want to then just move them one category over, right? So for the converger, getting them to think about like the theory a little bit more, or maybe just trying it next time a little bit more, doing it in one different way that they've never experienced. The diverger benefits from being forced to act a little bit more, or thinking less about perspective and more about the single unifying theory that underlies what the decisions they're making, okay? So ultimately, that brings me to my summary. I know that's a lot of theory, but I hope we were able to connect it to some element of practice over the course of the last 45 minutes or so. Because ultimately, adults aren't just big kids. They don't just learn by being passive sponges. They have to be primed. There are those big assumptions that we underlie adult learning, including relevance, self-direction, internal motivation, and problem-centeredness. We have to target the ZPD at every stage of what we do as bedside educators. We have to be aware that that exists, and we have to be constantly asking ourselves, are our learners in that ZPD? If they're not, we have to draw them back from that danger zone or push them out of that comfort zone so that they're constantly growing. Nobody's got time today in today's world with how full medicine training is to just spend their time in either of those places. So ultimately, the way that we can inform that is by better understanding our learners' style and preference. And the more we understand that, the easier it is to help us push them into their ZPD, whether that be, wow, they're really too comfortable. Let me do something that'll really put them outside of it by moving to a totally different preference. Or maybe it's, wow, you're overwhelmed right now. Let me teach from a place that I know you're going to be comfortable with, that I know that you can actually learn the most out of. Ultimately, we have to be catalysts for change, because that is what we do as bedside educators, is change behavior over the course of that very quick clinical training that we have them for. I hope that was helpful. I'm happy to take questions if people have them. Yeah, what questions do folks have?
I have a question, Dr. Stull. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, that was super interesting. My name is Kaylin Focus. I wondered how you assess your learners. Like, do you pay special attention to setting expectations, like a special orientation session when you're working with people to figure out where they land? And what
That's a
kinds
great
of questions are good to ask to figure that out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, yeah, I mean, I live in an environment that obviously is pretty stressful, right? We live in a, emergency department, and my learners are kind of unique because I work with them for maybe 8 hours and then potentially never see them again. So we have to set expectations quickly and effectively. And that's one way. Let's be honest, they show up to the emergency department. There are patients lining the hallways, like asking for food, asking you to get them a like asking you to, save their lives. And that is an overwhelming environment to put a student in. Same thing with the ICU. These are the sickest of the sick patients, and they show up and are not primed. And so one of the ways I immediately sort of assess them is I assume they're going to show up in their danger zone. Because I'd say 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 students do show up in those environments, particularly in their danger zone. And so I work to pull them back by simple things like introductions. I know this falls on, I'm preaching to the choir here because you're all, thoughtful medical educators, but we know that basic human decency in medicine died a long time ago. And so it's sad to say, but it's true. We all know that we all experienced probably during our clinical training, that experience where you were on a service for 4 weeks with someone, a resident. And at the very last day, they're introducing you to a patient and they're like, this is student doctor, and then like are furiously looking for their badge. Heck, maybe some of us have done this once in a while to our students. That feels terrible. And so things that I do are like learn their names. I'll be honest, the best book I've ever read is How to Win Friends and Influence People. We like have such a dopamine surge when we hear our names. So I always learn my learner's name, or if I don't, I cheat and write it down at the top of my, list or something like that. So I make sure I always have it on me and don't have to depend on my badge. The other thing is I ask what I like to call a throwaway question during my introduction. So I always ask something that is absolutely no stakes, but that requires them to answer with something more than small talk. So for example, like when you meet someone like, oh, where are you from? That's small talk. Everyone asks that potentially, especially in the Midwest. You people are very nice here. I'm from Jersey. That's not something we do well. But ultimately, I like to, so one of my throwaway questions is, what was your college major? It requires them to tell me something about themselves, but yet that I can immediately delete and will have no bearing on the rest of my shift because I have a lot of things going on in my mind, right? So like, I like to ask that. One question I refuse to ask, especially my early learners, is what specialty are you going into? That immediately puts them back into their danger zone because one of two things has to happen. They either have to lie to me because they're worried that I'm going to like judge them for going into something that I'm not doing, or they have to be brave and tell me something that they feel like may influence their grade. We all know it doesn't, but they often feel like it does. So I really set it that tone and drive them out of their danger zone with asking those questions. And then I set expectations. You're exactly right. Like all of us should, and say we probably regularly do, is tell them what it takes to survive and thrive, hopefully under my leadership or under my education in the emergency department. Does that make sense? That answer your question? I might have taken it in a different direction.
No, I think so. In fact, your quote unquote throwaway question, I think is a nice answer, really, because you probably get a sense of what they are good at also, I would imagine. If it's literature.
Right. I mean, sometimes, and like 9 out of 10 of them say something like biology or something in the applied sciences. And for me, then it's like, okay, cool. But every once in a while, someone tells you something fascinating. Like, oh, I was a business major. And then, 20 years later, I'm in med school. I'm like, okay, this is going to be a different kind of experience for me. Two, I think maybe you were asking the question of how do I assess like what kind of learner preference they are. I will tell you, I think some of that comes with time. Obviously, being a residency director, you get to know this over the time of the residency that you work with. But it's pretty easy to tell, especially I'm a huge learning theory fanatic, obviously, and I love Kolb's. And so like one of the things we actually do on what is it? I usually do it the first week of residency is I actually have them take the Kolb assessment and plot themselves like in the room on where they are. And I'll tell you, I can almost pick them out of a crowd. Before the end of the first week, I could probably put money and win some money on where each of them will be, because it just becomes really obvious. And again, I oversimplified and gave you the really this level of Kolb's, but as you dive deeper into each of these areas, you can really get a sense of what these people value and what they're all about. And it really helps me on shift because, when we're really struggling to connect over some concept, I always step back and say, okay, where are they at? Are they, struggling because I'm not explaining it from a theoretical standpoint because I'm way over here as an accommodator and they're more of a diverger thinking about, the patient's perspective. So that's generally how I use it. Mike, I see your hand up. You want to have a question or a statement?
I want to build off of the impact of on assessment. I'm curious if you've ever done this with your faculty. I love the fact that you very genuinely said there's not one right way of learning, and yet I think when it comes to working with these trainees, we, or I'll use the first person, I may not always honor that. I know that I'm an assimilator, and I like working with students that are also assimilators, and I don't trust students who are quickly in the accommodating space. I'm like, oh, slow your roll. You're jumping in and doing stuff that is above your station, and you don't even really know what you're doing. Stop, think, understand first, and act later. And ironically, I also then realized that I want my senior residents functioning in a different role. A senior resident who's still firmly in assimilating, like, I need you to step into leadership now. Like, stop asking me about everything. Now I really do need you to step forward and do, and don't even ask me all the time. Know when you can act without me. But I really have to check myself that I am not grading according to how well they match my preferred learning style.
I think that's great insight, Mike, about because we all have this bias as well, right? And I think that being aware of our biases as educators, and we're not talking even about the implicit biases of the world, we're talking about our learning preference bias. That can drive a great deal of the way we assess our learners. And so going back and because I do the same thing, I really try to go back to the RHYME model, for example, and say to myself, did they report? Did they interpret? Did they manage? Or did they educate me? Because you're right. I'm an accommodator, and I love when a learner jumps in and is getting the blankets for the patients and it's trying to cut off their clothes. Sometimes they're a little too aggressive and they're cutting off clothes of patients who are totally stable, and you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Let's leave their pants on, and so there's two sides to every coin. But stepping back and I think rooting it in the behavior and what level they should be at, I think goes a long way. That's why I really lean into RHYME every time I evaluate a learner, especially for the medical school. Amy, you had something to say?
Yeah, no, I just want to follow up on Mike's comments because there is no great medical education grand rounds if Mike and I can't get into a debate. So nothing drives me crazier than a student telling me what kind of learner they are. And I think you've said this many times now, Matt, learning preferences. And I think I think this is what Kolb actually tells us, is that we have places where we feel more comfortable. But I think the Kolb model is, I think, really come under a lot of scrutiny, especially in the last couple of decades, as not really holding up to research. So for example, if you align your methods with the kind of learner that students are, you don't see improved results. So, and I don't know if, maybe you're aware of, studies that actually do support the model, but I think what we can definitely learn from the model is that people do have these different preferences, and that if we if we are able to move our teaching approaches through the various quadrants of the model, then we're probably giving students the most robust experience, and also are appealing to different learners. It doesn't mean they're going to learn better one way versus another. And that's the thing that makes me crazy, is, well, I can't learn that way because I'm this type of learner. And I don't think there's any evidence to support that statement.
I agree with you. I think a lot of people typically associate learning styles with more of the VARC class, the audio visual. I've had plenty of learners say to me, I don't learn through being talked at or vision. I have to do it. That's not true. You're absolutely right. There is no data to support such concepts. That the only, and what I like about Kolb's is you have to go through the whole process in order to learn anything. And it should not, I think, inform the modality, right? I can't get residents to learn how to do a central line no matter how much of an assimilator or diverger they are, just by watching or just by understanding the indication or theory. It takes a full turn of that cycle to actually learn it. I think it just can help us as educators step back and both, I think to Mike's point, be aware of our bias, but also, you know, clinically, we're typically only working with one or maybe a handful of learners as opposed to an entire classroom full. I don't think this is there. I think you're absolutely right. This does not hold weight in the more traditional classroom style learning. I've never seen this put up like in a true meaningful fashion in a clinical learning environment. But if you have papers for me, I would always love to consume them.
Do we have other questions for Matt? Or comments? Okay, Matt, I think, on behalf of everybody, we really thank you for a very dynamic and interesting presentation this evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Nice job, Matt.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Matt. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.